Going to give it a couple more minutes just for some other people to get on the call. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're here with Carly Jo Dixon and Jessica Johnson from the Texas Fair Defense Project. They're going to talk about the state of Texas's driver's license reclamation regime and its consequences. As some of you might remember, DAYL's Equal Access to Justice Committee partnered with TFDP in the before times, i.e. 2019, to host a driver's license reinstatement clinic where we were able to help 50 clients get on track to have their fees waived and their licenses reinstated after they were suspended. We're also going to partner with TFDP for a similar clinic in April if any of y'all are interested or would like some more information, but I'll let Carly and Jessica do that plug because they're a lot better at it than I am. And anyways, without further ado, I'll hand the mic to Carly and Jessica and disappear.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you so much for inviting us here. As many of you know, we originally were scheduled during the snowpocalypse, so we are back with much more beautiful weather today. I hope everyone has recovered from that as well. We are going to just some housekeeping stuff before we get started. We're going to go for an hour, but there will be some sort of dedicated time at the end for questions. But feel free to use the Q&A feature. It is a chat feature, but it is not the chat feature. There will be times during this presentation where we ask you to answer some questions. You're going to put your answers into the Q&A feature. You may be answering a question by asking a question with that feature. Don't let it confuse you. We will work through it as we go along. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. My name is Carly Jo Dixon. I am the managing attorney of client services at the Texas Fair Defense Project. The next slide, we will talk about what TFDP does, but just briefly, myself, I manage our client services. That includes driver's license restoration, Class C tickets, really helping people get out from under the cycle of criminal legal debt, which leaves folks, as you're going to hear about today, without the ability to drive legally, interacting with law enforcement even more than they should, and other repercussions that we're going to go through in great detail. I am joined today by Jessica Johnson, and I will let her introduce herself briefly.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica Johnson. I am the director of pro bono programs at Texas Fair Defense Project. So I recruit, train, and supervise attorneys to take driver's license restoration cases. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is, what that means, and about our pro bono programs here in a minute. So I will pass it back to Carly Jo.
Thank you. So briefly, the Texas Fair Defense Project, our mission is to end the criminalization of poverty in Texas. And we really work in the intersection of poverty and criminal justice. And there's a bunch of different tools we use. The main ones are direct services. That is some of the work we're going to talk about today. We also use policy advocacy on the local and the state level. We are working right now over time at the Texas legislature. There are a lot of exciting and scary things being proposed this year that we are working to try to make the criminal legal system more fair to folks who come into it without an ability to pay. And then we also do strategic litigation. We do have active federal litigation in Dallas regarding pretrial practices and bail. You may have heard of that if you sort of keep up with that sort of thing. So those are the three main things of how we do the work. I want to just talk briefly about what the work is. So I'm going to go through a couple of our programs. One is the Freedom to Drive. That is this program. We internally take and place cases. I have a full caseload of folks who have criminal legal debt related to tickets that they just cannot afford to pay, and are facing warrants, jail times, driver's license suspensions. We also, through our pro bono program, that Jessica manages, place those cases with attorneys. We will talk about, if you at the end of this are like, I want to take one of those cases, how to get involved. We also do clinics, as Patrick mentioned, where we pair attorneys and law students with people needing the help. We are doing those clinics right now in a virtual model because of the pandemic, and we really had to transition but they're working. And so we're excited to be able to continue to do that work despite us all having to be apart right now. We also do pretrial reform, looking at bail, trying to make sure people are not being kept in jail pretrial just because they can't afford their bail. We do probation reform, particularly around fines and costs, making sure that when folks get probation, they are not being set up to fail simply because of their income. All of this is related to criminal legal debt. We work on fines and costs throughout all the sort of issue areas in the criminal legal system. We also work on right to counsel, making sure when someone is accused of a crime, they are given a court-appointed or a public defender, and that person is competent. So really trying to increase access to public defenders across Texas, but also really push the bar on like what it means to represent someone who's been accused of a crime. We do criminal records clearing, that is expunctions, non-disclosure. That is a new program that really came out of our community lawyering, which is like listening to the folks who are most affected by these policies and practices and figuring out what they might need or want and how to work with them to really solve the issues that they are seeing in their communities. One of the things that I think is special about TFDP is we really take the experiences of our clients and try to elevate their experiences and their voices in our other work, whether that be policy work or litigation work. So let's talk about today. Today we have broken it up. This is our roadmap into 3 different sections. We're going to first talk about the cycle of ticket debt. What are we talking about? What does it mean? Why does it matter? Then we will talk into like, what does it take to restore someone's driver's license? We do a very detailed nuts and bolts presentation. This is not that. This is an overview, but you'll be able to see, hopefully through this presentation, that so much of this work, even if you've never done any work that's criminal or criminal adjacent, maybe you're not an attorney who goes to court, you can still do this work. And so hopefully that will shine through in this presentation. And then we'll talk about ways that you can get involved with TFDP's work. So let's start with just talking about the cycle of ticket debt. We like to ground our conversations in the voices and experiences of our clients. So we are going to start out with a short video.
I was without my license from till recently, to back to 2013. And the issues you have is you are limited to what you can apply for as far as work. If you get stopped and you have a job, you go to jail. So you lose your job and then you're back to square one. You know, you have to reapply somewhere, get another job. And all this time, you have gotten so far into debt behind there being no way out, that, you know, you're going to end up doing the same thing over and over and over.
It's pretty terrible. It's impacted almost every part of my life. Obviously, I'm not supposed to be driving without a license, but because I have to, I don't live where there's public transportation. So in order to get to work or take my kids to school or go to the grocery and buy food, I have to drive without a license. And so that's very scary, especially if you see a police person, a policeman or woman. That part's terrifying.
I ended up in jail maybe 4 times behind a suspended license. And every time it was 3 weeks I had to stay. And there's no employer that will hold your job for 3 weeks, you know, especially in the field that I was in, construction. They get someone else.
So for years, there were a lot of things, jobs I'd have to turn down, jobs I'd lose, like if there was a bus strike or if I had missed a connection. And that's nothing you can write down. That's something you can explain to your boss because that has nothing to do with your employee.
Like, yes, there's school buses, but that's not always convenient for my kids because I have a son that's in UIL and I have to pick him up. I have a daughter that's after school tutoring, sports and stuff like that. So I needed a driver's license to get them there.
But it's actually also impacted other parts of my life, like being able to rent an apartment, you need an ID, to enroll in any sort of programs to better your future. Like I have a bachelor's degree and I wanted to enroll in a teacher certification program, but I can't because I don't have a valid ID. So even to get ahead, to get a better job, I'm not able to do any of those things without an ID, without a driver's license.
So those are just a couple of brief stories of folks that we have been able to help through our programs to really get people back on the road. I want to take a minute to talk through what is a Class C misdemeanor. So in Texas, traffic tickets, and that is primarily what we're talking about, are traffic offenses, are criminal offenses. Now, they're not felonies, sure, you know, more serious offenses, they're misdemeanors. They're not Class A, which is the highest or most serious misdemeanor, and they're not Class Bs, although there are some Class B misdemeanors related to driving, commonly like DWI, driving while intoxicated, is a Class B misdemeanor. We're not talking about that either. We are talking about offenses that are mostly things like speeding, having a taillight out, driving with your inspection or registration expired. The most common Class Cs that we see in our client population are driving without insurance, driving without a valid driver's license, and being pulled over for expired registration. All of those we think of as sort of offenses that are related to poverty. We're going to talk about the cycle, the never-ending sometimes cycle of driver's license being suspended. But folks, once they get caught in that trap, often can't get out. And it's almost always because they can't afford to pay something, not because they're an unsafe driver. In theory, these offenses come with a fine. They don't come with jail time. You have probably gotten a ticket, and maybe you've gone down physically to the court to pay it. Maybe you've sent in your payment, called it in over the phone, made payment, you know, with a credit card, and then just been done with it. And this is not something that our clients can do. They are not entitled to attorneys for these higher level charges that I mentioned. You could be appointed an attorney, but for Class C misdemeanors, because in theory, there's no jail time associated with the charge, you don't get an attorney. So folks go into these systems, into these courts alone, and it can be complicated, particularly if you can't afford to pay or you want to challenge, you know, what the officer is saying happens. The courts that handle these types of charges, they're called justices of the peace, and each county has several. There may be, you know, 12 in a county. That's approximately how many there are in Dallas County. I don't have it in front of me, but I know there are quite a few. Or municipal courts. So those are city courts. Dallas Municipal Court, Mesquite Municipal Court, Box Springs Municipal Court. All those are examples of sort of local city courts that handle these type of offenses. At the city level, you would get it from a policeman, a Dallas police officer. At the county level, it would come from the Department of Public Safety, a DPS, a state trooper, or perhaps a sheriff or a constable in the county. So these courts are the highest by number level courts in the state. I want folks to go ahead using that Q&A feature to just tell me how many total misdemeanor, these Class C cases, do you think were on the dockets of municipal courts and justice of the peace in 2020? And just to reiterate, you would be asking a question, even though that seems confusing in the Q&A, but you can type your answers in there. So how many, Jessica? How many do we have in 2020? Over 17 million. These are the highest volume courts in the state by the number of the cases that they process. And for the large part, the people who are using these courts are low-income Texans. Most of us pay our tickets when we get them. Maybe we go in and fight it, but most people don't. Most people are only showing up to these courts because they cannot afford to pay the underlying offense, and they're there to try to get some relief, even if they don't know what that is. So let's talk about the cycle that I've been referencing. We're going to start with just a short example of how this might work for a person. If someone gets a ticket, let's say they're pulled over. They're pulled over for speeding. Maybe they're pulled over for a taillight being out. You know, they're pulled over for what seems to be something that's just not a big deal. They go down to the court. They agree to pay the ticket, which is a conviction. That's okay. One conviction for speeding might be all right. But then in this scenario, they can't pay it. Perhaps this is a mom. She works for minimum wage, $7.25 an hour. She's working 40 hours a week, but she is still barely able to take care of her children on that salary. And so she falls off on the payment plans. At that point, the court is going to likely send out a warrant, enter her ticket into this program. It's called the Failure to Appear or Failure to Pay program. We also call it OmniBase. We will call it that today. And that ticket is going to put a hold on the renewal of her driver's license. So let's say that date comes and goes. She can't renew her driver's license, but she keeps driving. Her driver's license is now suspended. She's got a warrant because she couldn't keep up with her payment plan. She gets pulled over again. At this point, the officer gives her a ticket. Well, the officer arrests her because of the warrant and takes her to jail, and also gives her a ticket for driving without a valid driver's license. So maybe she's not committed to jail, but she does spend 48 hours in jail. 48 hours in jail. She may have lost her job. If her kids were in the car, there may be CPS involvement. We're going to talk a little bit more about the cost of warrants later in this presentation, but she's gone to jail. She's gotten out. She now has a new ticket for driving without a valid driver's license. She goes down to the court. She is trying to be responsible. This time she agrees to do community service. The court says, you know what? I see that you can't pay this ticket. We'll give you community service. Well, what they don't tell her is that's a conviction for driving with an invalid license. And it comes with another suspension on her driver's license. So despite her being as responsible as she can on her tickets, she still has a suspended driver's license. She may successfully complete that community service, turn it into the court. Her driver's license is still suspended. The next time she gets pulled over, she might be charged with a Class B misdemeanor of driving with a suspended license, because the second time they can enhance it to a higher level criminal charge. So at this point, it's a real charge. She's looking at up to 6 months in jail and a $2,000 fine, which started with her not being able to pay her original ticket and not really understanding whether there were options out there. The options exist. In theory, courts are supposed to say, if you can't afford to pay your ticket, we could give you a payment plan. It's supposed to be something you can afford. We could do community service, or we could waive it if community service is an undue hardship. Unfortunately, the courts often require you to use sort of like magic words to get the clerk to even tell you about those options. So if you don't know the magic words, you may be told, pay your ticket, that's the only option. Or you might be told, here are the alternatives, but here are all these hoops you have to jump through in order to get into or to qualify. It may be to get to community service, you have to go to court 3 or 4 times, to turn in your paperwork, to see a judge, to check in. And so even when those options are available, they're often very hard for people to access. All right, so let's talk about warrants. It sounds like something was not turned on last time with the Q&A features. So am I to understand that the Q&A is turned on and people can use it now? And answer this question. How many Class C warrants do you think that the Texas Justices of the Peace and Municipal Courts issued in 2020? The answer is over 1 million. Over 1 million Texas had warrants for their arrest related to Class C tickets in 2020. I mentioned earlier that these are fine-only offenses, that in theory they don't come with jail time, but in reality they do. If you are arrested and taken to jail, even for 24 or 48 hours, that is real jail time. There are some places who will also put you in jail at $100 a day for your tickets across Texas. I run into people who've spent months in jail, literally for the only reason is they are too poor to pay their tickets. When people don't pay their tickets or they don't appear in court after they get a ticket, the consequences sort of escalate. It could be this arrest and jail time. Being in jail is dangerous, particularly right now during COVID. It can be a death sentence for people and has been. You will lose your job likely, even if you're only in jail overnight and you don't show up the next day. If you call your boss and tell them you're in jail, you may lose your job. And if you no call, no show, you likely will lose your job. And then if your kids are in the car, there are custody concerns, maybe CPS gets involved. It can take what is for most of us just an ordinary inconvenience and turn it into a life-altering event when you cannot afford to pay. Your traffic tickets and your driver's license has been suspended. That driver's license suspension comes at the cost often of your job. If you don't have a driver's license, fast food restaurants want you to have a driver's license. You don't drive as part of your job, but they will not hire you if you don't have one, and they will fire you if they find out your license is suspended. It may impact your housing. It certainly impacts your transportation. A lot of times when an officer pulls you over and sees that you have an invalid license, they will literally take that license from you. So now you no longer have a photo ID. In addition to having a suspended license, you can't cash checks. You know, the ripple effects on folks for these driver's license suspensions are huge and impact all areas of their lives. The warrants not only come with the threat of going to jail, but they come with the fear that comes from like looking over your shoulder all the time. I talk to my clients who say, once we've gotten their warrants lifted, their driver's license and back in place, that their physical health improves in a way that they did not even know. They were sort of like living under this anxiety all of the time of being pulled over, of going to jail. And so some of these impacts aren't as quantifiable, but when we talk to people who've sort of come through on the other side, living without warrants, driving legally, they really can physically feel the difference. So one of the things we've mentioned is this OmniBase program. OmniBase is it's an opt-in program. Courts don't have to use it, although most in Texas do. TFDP has really been trying to work with jurisdictions, including Dallas, to get them to pull out of the program. They have all these tools for getting people into court. They don't need this additional one that really penalizes people for being poor. Recently, the city of Austin ended this program. The Harris County Justices of the Peace ended this program. So there is some momentum on getting courts to leave this program, but there's 354 counties in Texas, each of them with multiple courts. And so going city by city and county by county is a huge endeavor. So let's talk about what we're talking about. How many Texas drivers do you think can't drive because of these holds? And the answer is over 1 million. You probably guessed it is a huge number of folks who cannot drive because of this program. I am going to switch over to our questions real quick. Sarah Michelle asked a question and is really about, I'm going to read it. This seems like an unanticipated inefficiency of the system. And yes, I agree with you. And the real question is like, what are we doing to change the laws? And we are constantly working on improving the laws, but locally and statewide. We do have a bill this session that is directly pointed at the OmniBase program. Last session, we were able to, in conjunction with partners, get rid of a program called the Driver's Responsibility Program, which created a civil surcharge on top of your traffic tickets and also came with the driver's license suspension. And we were able, with that legislation, to get millions of people back on the road. And we are working to try to do the same with the OmniBase program, which is either end it, that would be the best. But if we can't end it, to build in some protection so that it is really targeted at people who are not paying their tickets because they can afford them, but not just punishing poor people. And so if at the end of this is not one of the things we necessarily have worked in, but if you're like, oh, I'm interested in that, we have a policy director and a policy analyst who would love to hear from you. So we are, actively working on bills, which were filed. The filing date was Friday. And so we have bills working through the legislature right now, directly on point to ending this practice.
And I will talk a little bit about the role that pro bonos can have in advocacy, but I will also mention just the effects of this. So we were able to advocate to help and convince Harris County to pull out of the OmniBase program. And that led to, do I remember the number? I think it was several 100,000 people that were able to immediately get their driver's licenses back because they no longer had these Omni holds out of Harris. Dallas, of course, is still involved in the OmniBase program. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward.
And we do have sort of like active local advocacy on the issue as well. So that is a place where if you have connections or know people who do, we'd love to hear from you as well. We've got to switch gears a little bit. We've got I think it's a tweet up from one of our partners who works with us in Harris County. And I'm just gonna read it. It is with sadness that I tell you about Preston Cheney, who died in the Houston jail of COVID. He was trapped there for 3.5 months because he couldn't pay $100 after being accused of stealing lawn equipment and frozen meat. His story is important. I would echo that his story is important. This was not a Class C case, but was a very low-level offense. And although I think that the tweet was directed at the bail that he could not afford to pay, it is worth noting that when people go to jail for Class C tickets, they're risking their lives. There is also really good data that shows that being in jail for just 48 hours, regardless of what you are charged with, increases your risk of being involved with the criminal legal system later. There is something about being in jail that does something to you physically, mentally, that is negative. I think we can all agree, like, jail is a scary, dangerous place, and we want to do what we can to keep people out of jail when it's not where they belong. These fine-only offenses don't come with jail time. And so really doing the work to make sure that folks are not inadvertently, it's built into the system, but inadvertently ending up in jail when jail is just not the appropriate punishment for these offenses. So let's talk a little bit about the law. The law can help. TFDP and our partners in 2017 really made the law in this area better. Fines, the punishment for the offense, they can be waived if an individual is too poor to pay them, if they're indigent, and completing community service is a hardship. Court cost and those OmniBase fees, which are also court cost, can be waived if someone can't afford to pay them or is indigent. And so there's really great mechanisms in the law. It's just getting that information in front of the court and in front of judges so they can make those determinations on a case-by-case basis.
All right, so as Carly mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, we do have a longer presentation of step-by-step nuts and bolts of what driver's license restoration looks like. That, of course, is not something for today, but we want to at least give you a taste of what driver's license restoration looks like. And so these are the necessary skills for driver's license restoration. I have a sneaking suspicion that every single person on this webinar has all of these skills. And I think, before I was with Texas Fair Defense Project, I worked at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. I was a civil litigator. I primarily practice family law for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So I know that there can be kind of an ick factor of folks who practice civil law feeling like criminal is a completely different animal and feeling a little hesitant. But especially because Class C misdemeanors are supposed to be involved in a pro se accessible process because, as Carly Jo mentioned, you're not entitled to an attorney. So folks should be able to navigate the system. Practically speaking, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But as attorneys, I am confident that you all have these necessary skills. And I'm going to go a little bit into in what way these skills are applied, specifically searches, drafting, storytelling, legal assessment, and negotiating. So there's two different types of Class C cases. And one is post-conviction and the other is pretrial. And I'll talk about pretrial in a minute. So in a post-conviction case, a person has already pled. Sometimes they don't realize that they pled, just like Carly said. If a person agrees to pay or pleads no contest, generally there's going to be a conviction. And then just like the scenario that Carly Jo was talking about, often folks say, okay, I'm just going to pay it. One, because they think that that's the only way that they can deal with it, or two, they really believe that they can pay it. We especially saw with the pandemic that there were lots of folks who were on track with their payments, then lost jobs and had all sorts of hardship that made it impossible for them to continue to pay. And so in these cases where somebody has already entered a plea, you can't attack the underlying ticket in any way. All that you can do is ask for the court to waive whatever fees they still owe. And so really what you're doing here is that storytelling piece that we talked about. You're trying to get the client's story in front of the judge, help them understand why it is that they can't pay, what their day-to-day life looks like. For example, we had a client who had a medically fragile child. And so in the motion for waiver, we were able to tell the story of what her day looked like, that she woke up every day at 6 a.m. and began doing various things for her a medically fragile kiddo, while also preparing other kiddos for school and all sorts of things that took her whole day so that she wasn't able to do community service and she wasn't afford to pay. So that's where that storytelling piece comes in. And other than that, it's drafting a motion for a waiver, and then the court has the ability to rule on the papers. So some courts will look at the motion, and if you have done a thorough job of storytelling, the court can just immediately make the decision to waive the fees without an appearance. Some courts want you to argue your motion for waiver, come in front of them to explain the situation more. But in these post-conviction cases, that's pretty much all that's involved. Often they can be dealt with completely remotely because it's a matter of getting your client's story, filling out some paperwork, sending it to the court, and that's it. So it's a very accessible process for attorneys. Oftentimes, pro se litigants don't even know of this option, and when they call the court, all they hear is, well, you're behind on your payments and you have to pay. So it's a really easy way for folks to get involved and help people navigate this system that's not incredibly intuitive. So then the other group of cases are pretrial cases. And so in these cases, a person hasn't entered a plea. Often they haven't appeared at all. And so again, there is a storytelling aspect. First, you help them prepare a financial affidavit. And so that just says what their expenses are, what kind of money is coming in, are they receiving public benefits, et cetera. And there's also room in that form for some additional storytelling. So you can add an additional sheet to talk about any other extenuating factors that affects their financial situation that maybe aren't spelled out in the prescribed lines of the form. Then you also will request documents. So you'll file a letter saying, I'm representing this person, please send me any documents that you have. And it could be the ticket, the complaint, et cetera. And so you look over those documents, you try to figure out what the strength of the case is. And based on that and your client's situation, you negotiate with the prosecutor. And so the pretrial cases are a little bit more involved, but still have very basic aspects and use those very basic skills that we talked about. And so now I'm going to move on to how you can get involved and talk a little bit more about the resources that are available if it's something that you would like to help with. So one way to get involved is direct representation. And so that's going to be that driver's license restoration that I was just mentioning. And just like I said, really what you're trying to do here is tell your client's story, bring the law into the judge's view, and bring the complexity to the prosecutor. And so we've had situations specifically where people have extenuating circumstances and they've done their best to bring that in front of the judge, but because they didn't necessarily follow a specific set of protocols or that they just didn't know how to navigate the system, that they aren't able to tell their story to the court. And so that's where you come in, is really making sure that you can tell this client's story to the court and do your best to help this person navigate these fines and get their driver's license back. And so one good thing about right now is that there are still Supreme Court emergency orders in place. Now they've recently been adjusted. However, they still leave a lot of room for courts to allow people to appear virtually. And so we encourage everybody to use motions for virtual appearance. Otherwise, there are a lot of folks whose driver's license are suspended and they can't do anything about it. There are some courts that aren't functioning at all, that aren't having court. But if you have an attorney to help you, they can talk with the prosecutor on the phone, negotiate, file paperwork, etc. So it is a great time to take a case because there is so much room in virtual advocacy. And so we have a lot of different resources for folks to help them feel comfortable in this process. And we definitely encourage folks who've never taken a case before, never done any criminal work. It is a very approachable process. So we have samples and forms, we have a bunch of recorded trainings, and then we also do one-on-one case supervision. So Carly Jo and I are there. If folks have questions, we'll do case strategy meetings, we'll review pleadings. And it really is a low stakes practice, but high impact results. Because again, this is supposed to be a pro se friendly process. But when the impact is that a person can walk away from this case with their driver's license, able to get a better job, able to avoid public transportation, especially in a pandemic, able to get back on their feet, it really can have a huge impact on people's lives. Carly Jo, will you throw the sign up link in the chat? All right, I'm going to move on. So we also have clinics that are going to be happening. So like Patrick mentioned, DAYL and TFDP did an in-person clinic. And so now in these COVID times, we're currently using a hybrid model. And so what that means is that the clients themselves are in person with a local service provider and the volunteers are virtual. And so we found that, especially because many of our clients don't have access to a laptop or don't know how to use Zoom, that a purely virtual model wasn't functioning for our clients' needs. And so that's why we've been using the hybrid model. And so on April 22nd, we will be doing a clinic in partnership with City Square. And so clients will be going physically to City Square, and then attorneys will be speaking with them virtually, going through what's going on in their case, etc. We also provide a 1 hour and a half training to prepare people for the clinic prior to the clinic, so that all volunteers know what's happening, know what's expected, and then Carly Jo and I will be supervising. And I think Carly Jo is also going to put a link to the sign up in the chat. We also, of course, have other opportunities. Like Carly Jo said, folks can be involved in impact litigation. We're currently involved in bail litigation in the Dallas area. We always need help with research and memos, et cetera. And one thing that I do want to mention, so as far as a direct representation, there is also an advocacy piece there. TFDP is a small but mighty organization of 11. Carly Jo is the only person who has a full caseload of the Class C misdemeanor cases. Now with 200, let me make sure I'm getting it right, 254 counties in Texas, and Carly Jo doing her best to take all of the cases. But it really is helpful to have boots on the ground, folks who are going into these courts and able to say, hey, I brought a motion for waiver in front of this judge and they just denied it without any reason. Or this certain court won't let a person appear if they have a warrant at all unless they pay a certain amount of money. And so there is an advocacy piece that when we have attorneys that are going into these courts and seeing what the practices are, that we get alerted when there are judges that aren't following the law, or if there are areas for advocacy or for education. And so it's really important when we get a pro bono attorneys to go into these courts that you are part of the advocacy and you are part of the education. Because sometimes in some courts, because they're only seeing pro se litigants, nobody's asking for waiver. They haven't looked at the law that says that your fees can be waived because nobody's brought it up. So it does have an important kind of macro level effect when pro bono attorneys are able to help with driver's license restoration. So with that said, we want to open it up for additional questions if you have them. We appreciate the question that we already got. But I will pause for a minute to see if anybody has any other questions that they would like to ask. And then also, while we are waiting for that, we do have a feedback form and evaluation. Carly, if you'll drop that in the chat as well. So if you'd like to give us feedback about this presentation, please feel free to fill out the evaluation. And otherwise, you have my contact information. If you have any further questions, if you have questions about how your firm could be involved, or you're interested in learning more about the clinic or signing up for a pro bono case, please feel free to reach out. Other than that, I think that's it. If there are no questions, I see a question. The question is there a portion of work that we do that allows people who might have lost their driver's license to get a new one?
So all of this work, we may have to go back to the word lost, right? All of this work, undoing these traffic offenses, undo suspensions on driver's licenses. So they're like directly connected. When you get a ticket you can't afford to pay, your driver's license gets entered in this program if you don't pay it, and then your driver's license is suspended. And so all of the work of sort of untangling this web related to Class Cs is getting the driver's license back to being eligible. I'm not sure if the word lost, though, means like literally somebody lost it. Just if someone has lost their driver's license and they don't have any suspensions on it, they can do one of two things. They can make an appointment online with DPS and then go down there and get a copy, or they can sometimes get a copy online. And so we don't, occasionally with a client, when I've gotten their license valid again, I will like literally do the process with them. But for the most part, we don't help folks get those underlying documents if they need like their birth certificate, or go with them to DPS. I do know that our partner for the clinic on April 22nd, City Square, who is a anti-poverty organization in Dallas, does specifically work on like gathering those documents. So helping folks get copies of their birth certificate or their social security card or the other things that they might need in order to actually go to DPS. And then in other parts of the state, Beacon in Houston and Harris County helps with those documents. We have an organization in Austin if folks are here to help with them. But we don't do personally any of this sort of like document collection for folks who don't have otherwise suspended driver's licenses.
Great, thank you for the question. Any other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any questions. So with that, I know we sent a lot of links in the chat, so make sure to grab those. And we can also send a follow-up email. So there's a form to sign up for the clinic. There's a form to sign up for taking a driver's license restoration case. And then there's also a training evaluation / feedback form. So thank you all so much for your time and attention today. You can see my phone number and email address on our last slide. If there are any other questions or if you want to connect regarding the work that we do generally or the clinic or anything like that, please feel free to reach out. But we really appreciate your time, and we are so glad that you all had us here. We hope that you guys have a good rest of your day.
Agreed. Thank y'all.